folks, Jack here from Peach Guitars. Welcome to another amplifier video. Today's video is not specifically a shootout, but I did want to pull together 3 amplifiers that all sit in the kind of Fender Brownface early 60s amps realm. So, this should make for an interesting video, but before I get into it today, let me please remind you to leave a like, comment down below with your thoughts when this video is through, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss out on any content from us in the future. Alright, so after a little bit of a hiatus, I've pulled together 3 amplifiers for another amp comparison video, which we used to do a little bit more of. I'm glad that they're back, and I think we've returned with quite a good subject of amplifiers. This is something that actually quite a few people have asked specifically to see. Most specifically to see a combination of, a comparison of the Fender Princeton Chris Stapleton amp, which is here at the front, against the Suhr Ombre amp. And as we've just received a shipment of the Suhr Ombre amplifiers, now seems as good a time as any to actually make that comparison a reality. And just for the sake of making this a little bit more interesting, I wanted to throw a third amp into the mix, which does not specifically sit in the Brownface amp realm, but it does a good job of copying some of those tones, which is up here, the little Dr Z Z28 1x10 combo. I wanted to keep the tones as simple as I possibly could, because that's kind of what this amp facilitates best. So I'm plugging this Gibson Custom Shop 64 ES335 guitar straight into the input of each of these amps in turn, with no other effects, no other pedals. You're just hearing the raw tones coming straight from the amp at a couple of different gain settings. I wanted to go for one which is fairly clean with the volumes around 3, and then I wanted to push it up to around 7, and then lastly just crank it all the way up, and you get the maximum amount of tube saturation. And that's where I think you really hear the character best defined in each of these 3 amps. So it should make for an interesting comparison. So let's delve into what makes each of these amps specifically very good. Okay, let's start with amp number 1 then, which I think is probably the one that people have wanted to see and hear from us for the longest time. So I finally got my hands on the Chris Stapleton Fender Princeton amp, which is more or less, as I understand it, a direct takeoff of one of Mr. Stapleton's prized amplifiers, which is a 6G2 circuit 1962 Brownface Fender Princeton amp. So these amps sound very, very different to the Princeton sound that we have come to know of the amps that came about 3 years later, the Blackface amps, which had much more clean headroom and more of a kind of scooped mid-range. These Brownface early 60s era amps had much more mid-range and much more saturation and complexity in the harmonics. Buzzwords aside, what that basically means is it's a little bit more overdriven, and if you want to go for some of those pseudo-Americana country type tones that Mr. Stapleton does himself, this amp is one of the best around for that kind of vibe. It's been upgraded from the original design with a 12-inch eminence speaker. So that does provide you a little bit more oomph in the low frequencies, a little bit more headroom to the amp as well, and a bit more volume. But it sits quite comfortably at about 12 watts. So it means that you can comfortably drive this amp into higher saturation levels just with the volume control. And it's not going to take your face off. It's a nice, pleasant musical sound. Being a Fender as well, they've implemented one of their very best amplifier features of all time, which is tube-biased tremolo, or vibrato, as they term it. So yeah, it's kind of built into the amp. Everyone knows what that sounds like, but when you've got tube-biased tremolo, it's a very different experience to some other certain forms of tremolo that we have come to know as well. The way that this amp sounds is basically how tremolo originated. So what you get here is a much more musical effect. It really interplays with the dynamics of the guitar at the cleaner settings and certainly at the higher end settings of the volume as well. Okay, so now you've heard the Fender, this leads me very nicely onto the second amp, which is the Suhr Ombre. And when this amp came out earlier this year, loads of people wanted to know how it stacked up against what was conceivably one of the only other Brownface derived amps on the market, the Stapleton. So the Ombre is kind of a direct comparison worthy amp, but this is, rather than based on the Princeton, this is based on the Brownface Deluxe of that time. In fact, as far as I know, John Suhr basically just wanted to make as close as possible a clone of his favourite 6G3 circuit Brownface Deluxe. So it's a little bit stepped up in power. You've got about 20 watts. It's also got a 12-inch Celestion speaker in this amp, slightly bigger cabinet, and you also have two separate channels, one normal and one bright channel. So similarly to the Fender, this also has tube biased tremolo on board. But I'm not going to delve too deeply into the features of this amp and the different tones between the channels, because that was already covered in our overview of this amp back when it first came out. So you can check that out in the description below if you want to find out even more about this amp. But for the purpose of today's demonstration, I wanted to get it as close as possible to the playing ground that the Fender is sitting in. So I've gone for similar tones. What I think you find with the Suhr is basically everything that's obvious. More headroom, a little bit more clarity in the low frequencies, a little bit better gain range from clean to distorted. Basically just a little bit more usable if you want to explore the full range of gain and EQ options, though maybe you might find it doesn't quite have the vibe that the Fender has, but I'll let you hear the clip and decide for yourself. Okay, so those are the two obvious competitors, the most closely associated with one another. The third amp I want to throw into the ring today is a little bit of a wild card, and it's the Z-28, which you will have seen in other videos from us in the past, sitting in various different tonal sweet spots. It can do a lot of different things, this amp. And the way I understand it is that Dr. Z just conceived this design based around the EF86 preamp tube, which is in V1 in this amp. And what that does is provide a very different tonal foundation to a 12AX7. It's a little bit more harmonically rich, it's a little bit fatter, and so to me at least, coupled with the 22-ish watts of 6v6 power in this amp, it sits very nicely alongside these two other 6v6 driven amps, and that EF86 provides that extra harmonic content that these amps also have. So you can see that on paper at least, it performs as a worthy contender in this field. However, what makes the Z28 so special is the way that the EQ and the gain circuits interact. So it's a very simple amp, just a single volume control as the other amps have, but you've got interactive bass and treble controls. And these are borrowed from the Route 66 as well. There's a certain family of Dr Z amps that all have this same front end. Basically past the 12 o'clock points on the EQ, you start to boost gain into those frequencies. So again, you can use that, particularly by boosting up the bass control, as you'll hear me do on the cleaner tones, to approximate some of the extra fatness that comes from these Brownface designs. Though when you crank up the volume, as I'm going to do for the overdriven clips, you can counter that by boosting the treble, and you get a bit more cut and a bit more clarity that way. So it's capable of a lot more than perhaps what these amps are, but it can sit quite nicely alongside them if you want to go for those early 60s Fender amp tones. So there we are, folks. I hope you enjoy the clips that you've heard in this video. Like I said, it was just direct guitar plugged straight into the amp, and sometimes that is the best way to go. You get the most organic, fattest, most natural sounds that way. All three amps do a great job of just translating the purest, most natural tones from your guitar into just this really gorgeous, warm, fat, explosive sound. Whether it's clean or dirty, I think you'll all agree, It's a pretty cool sound. Do you want to find out any more information about any of these 3 amps, or indeed any of the other Fender, Suhr or Z amps that we stock at the moment, then make sure you click the link in the description below and head to peachguitars.com to do so. That's it for another video. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.